in action. I may be the president of the Dan Croxall fan club, although I think there's a lot of competition. So Dan is an expert in the field of craft beer law and its regulatory environment. He teaches the first craft beer law class at a law school in the United States. And he's frequently called upon by the media to comment on trends and issues in the craft beer world. He studies and publishes on a wide variety of topics within this industry, including constitutional issues, unfair competition, antitrust, distribution contracts, intellectual property, and more. And his work's been published very impressively in the Northwestern University Law Review, the Gonzaga Law Review, and he's got a forthcoming law review article in the Loyola Law Review. And he also has a book contract with Carolina Academic Press for the world's first craft beer law textbook, which he anticipates finishing in 2021. My experience of Dan is he says he'll get something done by 2021. It could be tomorrow, who knows, because he's such an overachiever type. I also have to tell you that he is the at least current reigning teacher of the year at the law school as well. And he's an absolutely fabulous guy. He's one of those teachers who asks a lot of his students and holds them accountable, and he's beloved for it. So if you could please join me in welcoming Dan, virtually applauding for him, I would be very grateful.
Well, I promise you I'm not nearly as impressive as Dean Schwartz made it sound. And I know that there's a lot more important things going on in our lives right now than craft beer law. So I want to thank you for coming today. And I'm hoping that this might be kind of a fun and informational, educational experience with a little bit of entertaining. So speaking of entertaining, I have what many people would probably say of their own, the world's greatest kids. And during the COVID quarantine, my son, he's a sophomore in high school, has always wanted a dog, and I promised him that I would get him a dog because he's been so good. So we got this little guy last night. He just wanted to say hi. And it's kind of shocking that his name is Brewer. I didn't name him, I promise. My family did. But anyway, thanks for bringing him in. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. I'm going to try to keep this very conversational. So I prefer to have questions, and if you have anything that you'd like to ask at all, please just, you can interrupt. I always have in my Zoom classes kind of keywords if somebody wants to jump in and ask a question. So today's keyword, if you want to ask a question, is aloha. So mid-sentence, whenever I'm talking, whatever, you can just say aloha and I'll stop and you can ask your question. You can also ask it via chat. So again, I know the environment outside is crazy right now. And so kind of craft beer law is not saving the world, but it is something that is fun and interesting. And a lot of students seem to really want to learn about it. So that's kind of why I'm here today. I thought I'd start really briefly with who I am and why I'm here. I went to McGeorge as an evening student. I was a full-time, I worked full-time, and I went to school at night. And I got a job at the world's largest law firm, and I represented unhappy companies exchanging money, essentially. They call it complex civil litigation, but it's just unhappy companies exchanging money. And I did some white-collar criminal defense, and I was just kind of working that big law life, spending most of my time at the office. And one day, my kids kind of looked at me and said, "Who's this hairy guy who shows up and yells at us every now and then?" And so I thought, it's time for a change. Coincidentally, my brother at the time opened a brewery in LA. This was 2010. And as he was getting open, he called me and said, "This is a regulatory mess. I have no idea what's happening here. I have no idea how to get open. Can you help me?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, it can't be that complicated." Well, it was. But we got him open and things started taking off about 2010, 2011, and his friends started calling me at the law firm and asking me to represent them and help them get open. And of course, the large law firm was too expensive. So I ended up leaving and opening my own law firm representing only craft breweries in California. And I was one of two attorneys at the time specializing in the area. And so I kind of learned through a baptism by fire and ended up representing these craft breweries. I had in a previous life, I used to teach English at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So I always kind of wanted to get back into teaching, and this job opened up at McGeorge, and I interviewed for it. And I'm primarily a legal writing professor, but they asked what else I might want to teach. And I said, we really should think about craft beer law. And they kind of looked at me like, what is that, like skateboard law or something? But no, it's actually an $80 billion industry. It's very, very heavily regulated. and it's a very complex area of the law. So coming into McGeorge, no one had ever taught this before. And sometimes I feel like I'm making it up, which isn't the case. What I'm actually doing is collating the laws and trying to make sense of them. And a lot of them don't make sense, as we might hit on today a little bit. They're kind of holdovers from prohibition. But we will talk a little bit about some of these laws, not too in depth, because I understand this isn't a fully legal group. It's not a group of exclusively lawyers or law students. So we'll just kind of walk through it that way. So people often ask me, like, what the heck is craft beer law? What is this thing? Well, craft beer law is the study and the application of particular regulations between each state. Each state has its own different statutory scheme with which they regulate alcohol. Alcohol is regulated differently between wines, between beer and distilled spirits, and craft beer law kind of has its own regulatory environment that you need to worry about. And in California, it's a license-based structure. So craft beer law, when I was actually practicing, I still have one or two clients every now and then, but basically what my role was in-house counsel. I would be the guy who they would call when they needed to do a distribution deal, which is extremely complex, when they needed to get open, when they had employment issues. So kind of a jack of all trades, but really centered in this regulatory environment about what a craft brewery needs to do in order to get open, stay open, and be profitable. So basically, the life of a craft beer attorney was the best thing that I ever walked into, except for this job. I would wake up in the morning, and from home, I might check client emails. I'd go out to my day, and I would probably meet a brewer at his brewery, his or her brewery, and gained a lot of weight that way, but it was a lot of fun, a lot of free beer. It does get a little heated and complex sometimes, but it was a really fun, cool area to be in because the clientele was wonderful. Most craft brewers that I know, actually all craft brewers that I know, are really good people, socially conscious, involved in their communities, and they just made for great clients. They were pretty much the best clients I've ever had. So that's kind of the shtick about what it's like to be a craft beer attorney. There are now 9 or 10 or so in California who really focus and specialize in this area. At the time when I was doing it, there was only 2, so it's kind of cool that I got to kind of put my fingerprint on what it looks like to be a craft beer attorney. And then with McGeorge's support, thankfully, the dean and Dean Moylan and a bunch of the administration supported the craft beer law class, which is now really popular. We've done 5 of them so far. Actually, our law review, our last issue of the law review this year is going to be on craft beer law. We have a bunch of authors coming in to write. So that'll be exciting. We're kind of growing this craft beer law thing, and it's getting kind of nationwide recognition, at least amongst the brewing community. So it's really fun that way. It looks like there's a question, Chris. Was it a question for me? No? Okay. So I'm going to start with just a little really easy framework of kind of what the laws are in this area. There are 2 main goals in alcohol regulation post-prohibition. One is to keep alcohol out of the hands of minors. Generally accepted policy that's a bad idea to let minors have access to alcohol. The other is to prevent overly intoxicated people from getting their hands on alcohol. So kind of all the laws that we see and the regulations that we see are kind of premised on those 2 concepts. Another important concept is the prevention of what we call vertical integration, which is where a manufacturer would own a retailer and a wholesaler. It's a single line in the industry. The state legislatures have found that that's bad for business, bad for consumer choice and consumer prices. So we have these kind of competing interests. And the way that the states try to regulate these is through what we call the 3-tier system. That means that a manufacturer needs to stay completely separate from a wholesaler, a distributor, who needs to stay completely separate from the retailer. They can't have any kind of relationship other than contractual. And so what that means is they're trying to keep manufacturers from having undue influence over retailers to push that particular manufacturer's product. When we institute those through what we call tied house laws. Tied house laws exist to keep that relationship separate. And the common example that I use for what is a tied house is the example of a saloon from like the 1800s, where a whiskey manufacturer might produce gobs of whiskey, and then it would then buy a retailer or perhaps curry favor from that retailer by giving them a new bar, maybe a new mirror or whatever they need. And then that retailer would be beholden to push as much of that particular manufacturer's product as possible. Legislatures decided that's a bad thing. We're going to keep them separate. There are a ton of exceptions to these tied house laws, but the rule is a manufacturer can't have any kind of influence, undue influence, over a retailer. Okay, so with that kind of backdrop, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about COVID. What's going on with COVID these days? It has obviously trounced many industries, craft beer not being accepted. These nationwide closures, the restrictions vary from state to state. It's led to a pretty serious threat to the craft brewing industry, like an existential threat, actually. You've probably seen headlines that alcohol consumption is up during the quarantine. And while that may be true, you have to read beyond that headline, and you have to kind of take a look at what's happening in your local craft breweries. So the thing about independent craft breweries that you need to understand is that you think of Sierra Nevada, or you think of Sam Adams, these breweries are brewing on the order of 3 to 5 million barrels of beer per year. Okay, and a barrel is 2 kegs, essentially. But 75%, according to the TTB, which is the federal regulating agency, 75% of these independent craft breweries brew less than 1,000 barrels per year. So they're really operating on these shoestring budgets. You're talking about millions of barrels at the top, and the majority, 75%, are at 1,000 barrels or less. So these closures have had a disparate impact on the smaller guys. While the sales of alcohol overall might be up, the sales of craft beer are not, and I'll explain why. Craft breweries essentially make money in 2 ways. Between 70 and 80% of the revenue for some breweries, probably most, is in taproom sales. In California, we are lucky that the ABC and the legislature allows our breweries to run taprooms, which is essentially when you go to a brewery and you see a bar, it's called a taproom, direct to consumer sales. That's where the majority of profit is to be made in craft beer. So when I'm making up these numbers, but if this pint of IPA costs me as the brewer $1.25 to make, and I can sell it right across the bar for $7, which is not uncommon, the profit there is substantial. That's gone. Okay, as soon as the quarantine hit, those direct to consumer sales were put on pause, and it's a huge chunk of every brewery's revenue. There are a few that are out there that are a distribution only model, but the vast majority of breweries that you're familiar with are operating with this profit from direct to consumer sales. One of the reasons there is because when you enter into a distribution agreement for a distributor to sell your product, it's basically a 30% loss for each item, for each packaged good. In the alcohol, in the craft beer world, it's about 30%. So I wouldn't be making that, $6.75 or $5.75 on that pint. It'd be minus 30%. But distribution's essentially gone as well. Okay, so 1, we've lost the taproom sale to direct to consumer. 2, restaurants are closed, right? And so there's nobody out there who's ordering kegs, who's ordering bottles to be sold. It's all pretty much dried up. And so once the closure hit, we were really left with to-go sales only in the brewing world, craft breweries. They could sell to-go and merchandise, and that's it. And that's not really enough to run the business. And the Brewers Association, which is the national trade industry, has released some numbers about the impact of the COVID virus on nationwide breweries. Breweries nationwide, I should say, not the big ones, but small breweries nationwide. So an April survey they took showed a really sharp drop in craft category sales, massive layoffs and furloughs, and a large number of craft brewery closures are expected. So one thing that stuck out to me, a question that I saw posed to the ABC was, given the current cost revenues and the current level of state and federal aid, how long do you project you can sustain your business with social distancing measures as they are now? This is from the Brewers Association. And the response was 2.3% were planning to close immediately. This was in April, they couldn't sustain it. 11.8% said that they could last 1 to 4 weeks. That's 11%. 1 to 3 months, 45.8%. That's almost half of the craft breweries in the United States felt that they could last between 1 to 3 months in the current state of social distancing and masks and not allowing people into tap rooms. And then 6 months to a year was a smaller number, 8.9%, but those were kind of the larger distribution-based type models. So what we have is this huge number of breweries, half, 45.8%, which are at risk of closing. And now with the second round of closures, it gets even higher. Every brewery that I've talked to, and I've talked to quite a few, my friends and my former colleague or clients, all of them have universally told me that they're just hoping to break even at the time right now. Just, if they could just break even, that would be a W for them. But most aren't. Most are slowly bleeding. And so I think we're going to see kind of a wide range of closures here. To date, 66.1% of craft brewery employees have been laid off or furloughed. So 66% of that workforce. In 2018, that was over 500,000 people who worked in the craft segment, whether brewers, sales, whatever. But 66% of those have been laid off. So through no fault of their own, we're gonna start seeing a pretty massive closure here. In the U.S. right now, we have roughly 8,150 craft breweries. So doing the math, if 2.3% close, which is that top number, that would mean 190 breweries. That's not huge. But if 45.8% close, that would be 3,735 breweries. So basically, you're going to halve the craft segment in the United States, unless something changes, like a vaccine, which would be wonderful. But we're waiting on that, obviously. In California, the California ABC, while California is not recognized as a business-friendly state, I think that's generally accepted, the California ABC has been very proactive with craft beer, and I have to applaud them for that. They've been very helpful. And so what I wanted to kind of mention to you today were a few of the things that the California ABC, the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board, has done to try to kind of ease this pain. Some were helpful, some were not, but I've just picked out a few to highlight. So I want you to keep in mind that the ABC's main duty is to protect the public, to keep alcohol out of the hands of minors and out of the hands of problem drinkers. So here's one thing that the California ABC did.
And aloha, before we get into that list, we do have a question. Given the financial outlook, are some craft brewers merging to try to survive?
That is an excellent question. Mergers are happening and consolidation is happening at a pretty consistent rate. Then over the last 3 months or so, it has dipped. But what a lot of breweries are doing is what's called an alternating proprietorship, where if I own a production facility, but I can't use it to its capacity, what you can do is bring in another craft brewer. It's called a Type 23, a craft brewery, and they can use your facility while you're not using it because the demand's not there to make their beer. And so a lot of people are kind of joining forces like that, and they're using each other's facilities. You have to go through a licensing process, and it's actually kind of a pain, but people have been doing that a lot lately. I don't expect there to be an uptick in mergers in terms of wholesale purchases or joining of breweries because the demand's pretty light. And despite the headlines that you see, alcohol's crushing it and whatever. No, it's actually not when it comes to craft breweries, because we just can't get that product out. There's the means of commerce have been limited. But the ABC is mindful of that. And what they've done is one example of a loosening of the regulations has been that the ABC has allowed breweries with no eating capability. Okay, so you're not allowed right now in California to sell beer as a craft brewery unless there's an eating component. So it has to be sold with a meal, okay? And if you're just a regular craft brewery, you probably don't have a kitchen or a restaurant. They call it a bona fide eating establishment. Don't ask me what that means, it's kind of tricky. But the ABC has allowed breweries with no eating capability to partner with a food truck, okay? Now it's no big thing, you've seen food trucks and breweries, that goes hand in hand, but the ABC has allowed essentially the brewery to bootstrap the food truck into making it a bona fide eating establishment. And in that way, they can still at least sell to customers who are coming to the premise to ostensibly buy food. I think it's more about the beer, but who am I to say? So it has allowed them to keep selling beer under this kind of bona fide eating establishment concept that otherwise wouldn't have been available unless the ABC took action and allowed it. So that's been very helpful. The problem there is that you can't sell beer or food indoors anymore. right? There was a period of time when you couldn't, and then they opened it, and now it's closed back down again. So another thing the ABC has done to try to help these businesses survive is they have allowed the premise. So you have to think of a craft brewery as a premise. You can't do anything beyond the scope of your premise, but they've allowed craft breweries to expand into public space. As long as it's okay with the city or the county that they're in, you can basically sell outside on the sidewalk if you have maybe a setup with umbrellas in a parking lot, for example. So the ABC took action and said that if we're not going to allow indoor, these places are going to close at a much more rapid rate. Let's let them sell outside, which has not been done in the past. That's something brand new. And so that's created another revenue stream for some of these breweries. As long as they're there to eat and you can partner with a food truck, then you can sell your beer, which is actually very helpful because you don't want your beer sitting around. A couple other things just to be mindful of what they did is they have the TTB, the federal enforcement arm, has allowed breweries and other alcohol manufacturers to make hand sanitizer, which I thought was kind of a cool thing. On the one hand, it's very helpful because we had a shortage at some point, at least I recall that being a shortage. So breweries and distillers have been allowed to make hand sanitizer. I've had a couple of former clients say, we're not going to get into the hand sanitizer thing because we don't know what we're doing. And what if we put out a product that turned out to be like wood alcohol or something and you could go blind, et cetera. But a lot of people have taken advantage of it. And so that's another kind of probably smaller revenue stream that the ABC and the TTB have allowed breweries to explore. And then kind of more generally, there's been this kind of policy of, I don't want to say it too broadly, but almost looking the other way on certain things that the ABC has kind of employed. And in that sense, they've slowed down on licensing deadlines. They're kind of not out policing the way that they used to, at least for the time being. Now, I did see some headlines recently that they're checking up on establishments to make sure there's actually food being served, et cetera. But they've kind of really loosened these restrictions that have been quite a pain for many breweries over time. So we can see that they're really doing their best to support the industry. They also, another thing is they have allowed what free delivery. Okay, so basically if I own a craft brewery, I can deliver to your house, put an order in online. Now that would traditionally be a violation of the Tight House laws. The Tight House laws, again, prevent the relationship between manufacturers, retailers, and wholesalers in the middle. But it also prevents a brewery from giving a thing of value to a consumer. So I can't tell you, come to my brewery, order a beer, and I'll give you a shirt. That's illegal because it's a thing of value. I can't post your retail establishment on my brewery Twitter because that's considered free advertising. There's exceptions to that. But so what they've done is they've now kind of waived that and allowed breweries to engage in free delivery service, which again has been helpful for those breweries that have maybe a Sprinter van or something like that. So we can see that the ABC has been proactive in trying to assist these breweries to get through this crisis. I still think we're going to see a tremendous closure though. What I'm hearing from the inside is people who are really up against the ropes. People who are talking about trying to sell their breweries. There's not a lot of buyers out there right now. Nobody has the funds or the capital right now to be investing in growth. I'm not sure why you would at this point until things reopen. A couple of the things they've done have backfired a little bit. You've probably heard that you can buy what we call growlers or to-go containers from breweries. It's been one of our benefits in California. Now bars and retailers like liquor stores can actually sell to-go off a draft, which they couldn't do before. You could never go to one of my favorite places here in Sacramento is called Pangea. I couldn't go there and get a growler fill because they're not a brewery. Only breweries have that privilege. But now they have allowed different restaurants, retailers to go ahead and sell what we call growlers or crowlers, to-go items, even though they couldn't do that before. Yay for the retailers, that's probably very helpful. Not so yay for the brewers, because that kind of cuts into their margin, right? If you're out looking for a particular beer and the retailer is closer to you than the brewery, then you're probably gonna go to the retailer, and then the brewery is gonna kind of lose that extra little kick of income. So kind of one of those backfiery things. It's good for the retailers, I get that. Not so helpful for the people that I'm certainly biased towards. Another thing that they've allowed that hasn't worked out as well as I think that they might have wanted is kind of retail to retail sales. So if I'm a retailer and I really want Pliny the Elder, but I can't get any for whatever reason, I can buy it from another retailer, which is strictly prohibited under the Tide House laws. But now a retailer can go and they can just get the product they want from another retailer, which again kind of takes away that order from the independent craft brewer. So it's kind of made things a little bit more difficult there. So I mean, that's kind of a little bit of an overview of what the ABC's done. I was surprised and delighted at the speed with which they acted. Jacob Applesmith, who's the director, is a really kind of proactive guy. He's kind of invested in growing the businesses and letting them achieve as long as they're being good citizens. But that said, even despite these efforts, most of them are really struggling. And so if you love your craft beer, your craft breweries, you should go buy to-go stuff as much as you can without overdoing it, of course, and merch and gift cards and things like that just to help keep them afloat. Now, those helpful things that I mentioned are actually very helpful, right? And so an interesting question that I'm exploring right now, and I'm trying to write an article on, which I'm not making great progress because I'm teaching a bunch, but these are temporary measures, right? Essentially, they're executive agency type measures. So by their very nature, they're temporary. Okay, so the ABC stated that these are temporary measures intended to provide immediate relief during this crisis only. ABC will not continue the policies contained in the Notice of Regulatory Relief when the pandemic has ended. Okay, I get that, but why? What's the justification for the ABC walking back these privileges that they themselves recognized were necessary to keep these industries afloat, to keep the craft beer industry afloat, I should say? So how are they going to justify that substantively? I understand the fact that a temporary authorization is temporary and by its very nature. And so how now are those are going to end, but how are they going to not allow these to go forward when they themselves recognize they're necessary to create revenue? So it's kind of like, we know this is really good for you, but haha, the pandemic's over, go back to your room. I'm not sure that there's legal justification there. If the agency itself recognized it, what's the purpose of it? To then harm breweries after this thing is over? So again, they're going to go away. They're temporary executive type orders, but I can imagine that many craft breweries are going to want some kind of legislative action to make them permanent. The ABC has said that they're not going to be permanent. So without a legislative battle, they're going to go away as soon as this thing is over, if it ever ends. If we get a vaccine, which would be nice. So what you might see is a battle between big beer, who does not like these kinds of loosening of restrictions because it's not good for their bottom line. They would much prefer craft breweries to close. They would much prefer nobody to be able to even get craft beer because they have their own like crafty kind of, you know my bias already. Not exactly craft beer because it's brewed in the same vats as things that rhyme with, I don't know, Schmud Light. They're brewed in the same vats, and then they come out and they release them and they say, oh, look, we're craft breweries too. Not really. But they would love to have those go away. So what you would see is a legislative battle between big beer and independent beer, usually a losing battle for independent beer. There's only one in California kind of lobbyist who's involved. It's the trade association called the California Craft Brewers Association, and they're always on the defensive, kind of fending off legislation that comes in every year in favor of big beer. So they kind of steamroll over. It's a grassroots type organization. So it's going to be really hard for independent beer to get these things passed. It will face stiff opposition from big beer, who wants their market share back, which they're consistently losing. One other thing that I'd like to mention before I'll just open it up to questions is I mentioned earlier that the craft brewing community are the best clients a lawyer could hope for. And I strongly believe that. If you kind of Google around a little bit, you'll see a lot of kind of the social involvement that breweries have. There's you'll indulge me on this. You'll remember when the Paradise Fire occurred, there was a nationwide, what they called a collaboration beer that Sierra Nevada actually created. It's called Resilience IPA. And they then sent out the recipe and some ingredients to breweries across the country. And the breweries brewed it, sold it, and the money was supposed to go back to the Paradise Fire Fund. Most of it did, some of it didn't, which is a little sketchy. There's a lot of talk about that. So they were selling the beer for a cause. Typically, that's illegal because it would be considered an inducement. Getting somebody to buy your beer for like a social cause would encourage people to buy beer who might not otherwise. But now that's happening with Black Lives Matter. There is a beer out there called Black is Beautiful, brewed by Weathering Souls Brewing Company, which is one of the few Black-owned breweries in the United States. And they've sent out that beer across the country, the ingredients and things like that. It's now being brewed in different states, and those funds are being funneled towards social justice. You'll see a lot of movement towards diversifying the craft beer industry right now in particular. The stereotype has always been kind of chunky white dudes with beards, kind of like me, but you're going to see a lot more female involvement. There's a lot more female brewers. There's queer-owned breweries coming out. There's Latino-owned breweries coming out. A lot more African-American-owned breweries coming out. So if you just kind of spend your time, Google around a little bit, check out what's going on out there in the social movement, and I think you'll find a engaged and active community who really wants to do good for their communities. And it's been really inspiring to be a part of. I feel like, kind of an imposter to some degree because no one's done this before. So I'm still feeling my way through the dark in what exactly craft beer law is. I think I have it pretty honed in now, but it's a really wide ranging group of things. Craft beer law is this little nugget, but it also has constitutional implications, particularly First Amendment, because the government tells breweries what they can and can't say. So that obviously raises First Amendment issues. There's a ton of intellectual property stuff going on right now, especially with trademarks. As the market gets more crowded, names become harder to come by. There's a lot of trademark disputes that are happening, a lot of fun cease and desist type stuff. There's a lot of employment issues. So it's kind of this weird little nugget that brings in all these different areas of the law. And I found it to be extremely pleasurable to be kind of on the forefront of it. And so I want to thank Dean Shorts for letting me do that. And I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. Let's do this.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. That's very enlightening and a very, very small tip, I'm sure, that you could get into. So yeah, we have a couple questions here. This one from Carrie. A city's regulatory burden seems to be a huge impediment to breweries opening with ease.
Yes.
What would recommend to the cities as they think about easing those regulations? What are the top 3 trends that you can recommend?
That's an excellent question. Local agency practice is another huge area of this law, so you kind of have to know who you're dealing with. Different counties, different cities have reputations for being more or less helpful than others. San Francisco, for example, is recognized as being extremely helpful to breweries. There are some other locales that are less so. And so on the local entity or local agency side of things, they could do a lot to kind of ease the burden that brewers face. One, for example, would be the zoning ordinances. If you could get a conditional use permit, even though it's not zoned properly for a brewery, breweries are typically considered manufacturing, but they could ease those kinds of restrictions and allow conditional use permits to operate in places where they might not otherwise be able to. Another big one that you might not come naturally is parking. So local agencies tend to have different ways they deal with parking. A lot of breweries don't come with parking lots. And so a lot of times a city will require the brewery to pay X amount of dollars per parking spot that should have been at the brewery. So they're saying if you're operating an establishment that's this many square feet with this many anticipated people, we're going to charge you 10 grand for 10 parking spots because that's what they would really require to operate this. Those kinds of things come into play a lot. And so you kind of have to have a background or an understanding of local agency law to lobby, to meet with business development agencies within the cities. And sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. It depends on if people object. Sometimes people will say, we don't want a brewery here. That's just going to bring in houses of ill repute and all that kind of stuff, which frankly isn't the case. The craft beer consumer isn't necessarily the one that you might be thinking. It's not like the frat guy who's out there just getting hammered. Most craft brewers are pretty sophisticated, or craft brew fans are pretty sophisticated, not causing problems in their communities. So I think, those are 2 examples of things that local agency practice could impact. If they could kind of loosen those type of things, it would help opening.
Yeah, great. And then so kind of going to the other side, what type of creative suggestions do you have for the breweries to navigate this time of possible opening and then closing and opening and closing from your side?
It's so painful to get those calls. I've had 4 over the last 2 weeks of people saying we're screwed. We're gonna close. what can we do? The one obvious thing that comes to mind is make friends with a food truck. Make sure that, and food trucks aren't uncommon to be connected with breweries, but now if you can bring in that food truck, you're essentially open again, at least outside. Okay, and your numbers aren't going to be as high as they were before all this happened. But if you could tie yourself to a food manufacturer and then you could be deemed a bona fide eating establishment, at least you can move your product. That would be my number one suggestion. The other one isn't related to what we're talking to, but the PPP has been very helpful for many small breweries. I know some who have literally only survived because of that. So if they haven't yet, if they can still get in on it, PPP is like absolutely huge saver for them. So those are kind of the two things that I would try to advise a client to look really carefully at.
Great. Yeah. So I have a question here from Chris. Can you talk about cannabis law that prohibit mixing cannabis and craft beer? And then what are some of those landmines that might be in that area?
That's an excellent question. So cannabis, people want to know, when's the THC beer coming out? I mean, I'll just go on the record and say I think that's a terrible idea. I just don't think you need people getting that wasted. Nonetheless, people want it. So why is cannabis, or THC, I should say, not allowed in beer? Well, the TTB, which is the federal regulating agency, the Alcohol Tobacco Tax Bureau, of course it's about taxes, they have a list. It's called the Approved Adjuncts list, which is if you want to add anything to beer other than malt, hops, or barley and water, those four things, then it has to be on that TTB approved list. And it's kind of random, like mango's on there, but bananas aren't, right? Coriander, no problem. Cloves, not so much. And this is a federal agency. So unless or until THC becomes legal federally, you're never going to see a THC beer authorized by the TTB. Now, I know that you can find some home brewers. There may have been, allegedly, a brewery in Oregon that was selling them out of the tap room. But you're risking your license by engaging in that conduct. So I would highly advise that unless or until the TTB decides that THC is okay and puts it on the approved adjuncts list, again, those things that you can add to your beer, I don't see that becoming a nationwide thing.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So speaking of kind of getting restrictions or having more restrictions and getting approvals, craft beers tend to have a little bit higher 6 to 7% range, more than those PBRs or Bud Lights of the world. Does the higher alcohol content make it any more difficult to get agency for these?
Great question. No, the agency doesn't monitor the strength of your alcohol in your beer. What they will regulate is your labels, right? You're not allowed to say certain things like uber strong IPA. They don't want you to make any references to strength or proof because they don't want people buying beer to get drunk, which is a bad idea. In California, if it's 5.6% alcohol or below, you don't have to put that on the label. If it's 5.6 or above, or excuse me, 5.7 or above, then you have to put that on the label. That's about as far as they go in terms of regulating, the ABC at least, in terms of regulating the alcohol content. So it doesn't matter if you're making a double IPA at 8% or a cask ale at 4%. It just, as long as it's your ingredients are approved and you're operating within your license strictures, then you're fine to make it. You can't distill, that's different. That will require a distiller's license. So you can't use a still to produce high proof alcohol, but you can make your beer.
All right, excellent. Yeah. So a couple comments on here. Just one, people are interested about your textbook. When that's published, would you send out an email or let people know? Maybe you can work with Cassandra to disseminate that information so people can see how to purchase that.
Yes, I will lean on Cassandra for that. I will say that my dear friend, who's now the dean at my law school, suggested I write a textbook, and at the time I was like, heck yeah, that sounds wonderful. And now I'm just like, oh my God, why did I do that? It's it's extremely time consuming, and it hasn't gone as fast as I had hoped because I love to teach, so I teach a lot of classes. I'll teach as many as they'll give me, and so that's kind of slowed it down a bit. But as soon as it's ready, I promise to tap Cassandra to make it public to the world. It'll be available on like Amazon. It's not a pure law school textbook, really. It's more of a practice. It's called Craft Beer Law and Practice. It's more of a guide for attorneys who are going to be representing craft breweries, and maybe even for kind of business savvy brewers to own, so they can kind of walk through the process that way. So it's kind of going to be more of a general appeal book. That's what the publisher wants, and so that's the direction I've headed. But as soon as it's available, you guys will be the first to know.
Wonderful. And I think that actually jumps into one of our next questions. You've already talked about from the brewer side, from the city side. What about people who want to become craft beer lawyers? Kind of what suggestions do you have for them? Obviously, you have a book coming out, so.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I get asked that question every time I teach craft beer law. A lot of students want to kind of get involved in this area, and I kind of have two ways to do it reasonably, and there's a third that I'll talk about. But the first one is you luck into it, like I did. There was 0% chance that I would be doing this unless my brother opened a craft brewery. If you have a connection in the industry, by all means exploit it. That's one way to get involved, and I think the most efficient. The other way is I advise my students to try to work at a smaller firm that has kind of a business focus and start to grow that practice slowly while working on other types of law until you kind of establish yourself. I think it's really dangerous to just go out and hang your shingle and say, I'm a craft beer lawyer, because they won't respond to that. I was joking with Cassandra and Dean Schwartz and Chris before this presentation about why I'm wearing a dress shirt, because I usually, when I talk about craft beer law, I wear craft beer t-shirts. So when I first opened my office, I went to the statewide craft brewers conference dressed like an attorney, dressed just like Dean Schwartz, and nobody wanted to talk to me. They're like, what are you doing here, attorney guy? Like, you're not one of us. So I quickly learned that it's jeans and t-shirts. But that kind of concept rolls into how dangerous and hard it might be to actually just hang a shingle and say, I'm a craft beer lawyer. They probably won't respond. It's kind of an exclusive group. You kind of have to have your bona fides. So working through a small kind of firm that focuses on business while growing it slowly and organically in your area, I think would be a good way to do it. Another way would be if you could get a job with the state agency. So in our case, in California, the Alcohol Beverage Control Board, if they have a staff of counsel, if you could be on that staff for a year or two, probably 2, 3, that would give you a good entrance into the market because you'll have that kind of street cred. I do have a friend who I guided through this over the last few years who did the hang out your shingle thing and said, I'm going to represent craft brewers. That's what I want to do. And I was like, okay, man, but I don't think you should because it's going to be really slow. And it was. But over time, he was able to grow it over about 6 months to 8 months or so. He started getting those clients, and now he's busier than he can be. So I'm trying to hook him up with one of my craft beer law students for an internship, that kind of thing. So those are kind of my thoughts on how to break into it. Lucky, do it slowly on a small firm kind of thing, or if you can get a job with the alcohol regulating agency for a couple of years, that would be fantastic.
All right, cool. This question comes from Pat. Breweries without a kitchen can serve their beer in the outdoors but they can't sell it at another location, i.e. out of the truck, the food truck that they're kind of bootstrapping into. Do you think that will ever be something that might get pushed through where the regulators would ever consider direct sales from a truck off premises?
I highly doubt it. And that's because a craft brewery is called a Type 23 license. And the Type 23 license is married to not only the owner, but the premise, the footprint, the actual physical plant. That's where you can and cannot, or that's where you can, conduct your privileges. And remember that making alcohol is a privilege, not a right. So they can tell us whatever they want, and we have to comply with it essentially, unless you challenge it on a constitutional basis or something like that. But I don't think a mobile outlet is likely in the future because our structure is designed around this premises footprint structure. And so I don't see them loosening that. That would be kind of a sea change. Although, frankly, I think it'd be kind of awesome if you were, if there was one parked outside of McGeorge. I mean, I can neither confirm nor deny whether I would patronize that since my dean's here, but maybe many students would after the day is over. So I think it'd be a great idea, but I don't see it happening because of the regulatory structure that's already in place. It would take a very substantial amount of modification. It'd be like a re-envisioning, for example.
Yeah. So you had made some suggestions about how to get beer clients. We actually have another beer craft lawyer here. Brian, if you want to unmute yourself and you have some thoughts on how to get some beer clients.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments, and I thought they were really good. I can just tell people that are on this Zoom meeting that I've got 4 beer clients altogether, and I got 2 beer clients just by mailing people letters with my letter of interest and resume, believe it or not. And then I got another 2 clients by joining up here. It's called the Washington Brewers Guild, but every state has a Brewers Guild, and that's one way to kind of meet the brewers kind of on a regular basis. And like you said, you show up in a suit and tie, I mean, you might as well not go, right? I mean, that's like dead in the water. And then the other 2 things I found that helped is until the COVID, I was sponsoring, 3 or 4 beer festivals, being a sponsor at the beer festivals. And I've also found LinkedIn is helpful in terms of reaching out and potentially setting up meetings and stuff. So those are just some additional ideas kind of along the same lines you were talking about.
Yeah, I think kind of going to the beer festivals here, I'm going to change my screen so that there's none. You've seen this is my old law firm logo thing. It's on my wall now because I had nowhere else to put it. But like you can see, it says, representing California craft breweries or whatever. So I used to go to those. I'd set up a table. I'd have my cards, I'd be sitting there with a beer and a t-shirt and jeans, and people were much more likely to come up. I couldn't give away my card when I was in a suit. But another way, and this is going to sound extremely difficult and impractical to get clients, but another way is to just go to the breweries, sit at the counter, enjoy your beer, talk to the person serving you the beer, be a good human being. And over time, eventually you might introduce the fact that, just general conversation. What do you do? Oh, I actually represent craft breweries. Boom, potential client right there. Because the regulatory scheme, and I would love to talk for 9 hours about this, is so convoluted and complex that breweries step in it once a week, every other day. They are constantly having to navigate this minefield of regulations of what they can and can't do. And the second they get popped, that's when we really start getting those calls. So frequenting the breweries, hanging out, getting to know the servers, getting to know the brewers. Eventually it's going to come up that you represent craft breweries or you're interested in that area of the law. And guess what? As soon as they get something that comes up, you're going to get that phone call. So it's a kind of an organic growth. Twitter is very, very useful. There's a whole beer law Twitter thing. I encourage you to follow me if you're not. It's at Good Beer Law Prof on Twitter. I just kind of keep it updated in terms of things that are happening. I haven't been as active this summer, been elsewhere. But yeah, social media can be very helpful. I have a blog called Craft Beer Law or Craft Beer Professor that kind of has more substantive stuff than Twitter. Just getting yourself out there and marketing that way. But the best part is that you get to drink great beer and you can chalk it up to marketing. And I believe you can write that off. So it's a lot of fun.
All right. And so we are approaching the end. So let's end with one final kind of fun question. What is on your must drink list?
That's hilarious. There's a guy named Dr. Charlie Bamforth. He teaches at UC Davis's Master Brewers program, which I now teach in too. But he is called the Pope of Foam. Apparently he is like the guy, world renowned. And I asked him that very question at a conference. And he said, he's got a Scottish accent. He said, "Mr. Croxall, I never answer that question in public." And I was like, "Oh, sorry. But I will answer that question in public." Your must drink list includes Russian River Pliny the Elder, period, end of story. My brother owns El Segundo Brewing Company down in LA. And I truly believe, not just because he's my brother and got me into this thing, but I believe they make very, very high quality West Coast style IPAs. So very hoppy, tend to have a higher alcohol content. If you're in the Sacramento area, we have an amazing craft brewery scene here. We did. Hope we still do. We had like 183 breweries in the greater area. We have some real highlights. If you head towards the Auburn area, we have Knee Deep up there. We have Moonraker, which is nationwide renowned for their what they call Northeast style IPAs, which are hazy. So Moonraker is a good one. We also have Fieldwork. We have one of their tap rooms here in Sacramento. That is a fantastic brewery. So I'm going to stop there, I guess, but I would go with Russian River, Pliny the Elder, anything by El Segundo Brewing Company, and I would also highly recommend Moonraker as well. Oh, and don't forget 21st Amendment. I know that our dean has a relationship with one of the owners, a friendship, and so I might as well throw in 21st Amendment as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so as we're wrapping up, speaking of Dean Schwartz, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with some last thoughts, comments, any last questions for Dan?
So I feel like if I had more time, I'd have to do a whole thing in defense of suits, but I won't do that. And instead, if you, I think the only thing that makes sense to thank Professor Croxall for his fabulous set of remarks is for us to grab whatever coffee or tea or brew and toast Professor Croxall. Thank you so much. I hope you all share my belief about what a joy it is to learn from him. This isn't my first time around the block listening and learning from him, and I'm always really grateful that I get to do so. Thank you so much, Dan. That was great.
Thank you, and to the audience, you guys, if anyone wants to reach out anytime, I love answering emails and thinking about beer stuff. So if you have any questions or any comments or anything that you'd like to discuss, please reach out. I'm stuck in quarantine like you, so I love to think about this stuff. So don't be strangers and don't be shy. It's never a pain. So please reach out if you want to chat beer or you have any specific questions or whatever. So I'm happy to try to facilitate that.
And please do stay tuned for future talks by our faculty and alumni. We really are trying to use the opportunity of the COVID to bring Professor Croxall's both an alum and a professor to the community, and so I hope you'll stay tuned and look for emails inviting you to future events.
Let me just close with one thing. I see a number of my former students on here, so you all made me incredibly nervous. I hope that didn't shine through. But thanks for coming, Megan, Paige, Katie. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Excellent. Yeah, in the chat, I'm seeing lots of thank yous, great jobs, so well loved. Cassandra, I believe you're going to send out an email. So what that will include, you can kind of let people know. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. Cheers, adios.
All right, stop recording.